The hurricane didn't knock. It detonated against the Florida coastline like something personal, like the sky had decided to settle a grudge. Sloane had worked the night shift at the Pelican Bay Marina restaurant 11 times during storm season. She knew the drill: board the windows, drain the decorative fountain in the main hall, stack the patio chairs, lock the boat slips. What she didn't know, what none of the safety checklists had ever covered, was what to do when she found a man bleeding to death behind the industrial freezers at 11:47 at night, with a Category 3 hurricane eating the Gulf of Mexico alive outside. She almost didn't see him. She had been doing her final sweep of the kitchen. The rest of the staff had left an hour ago, the restaurant manager calling it early when the surge warnings upgraded. And she was moving fast, yanking the pull cords on the overhead fluorescents when her foot caught something. She stumbled, reaching for the stainless steel prep counter to catch herself, and looked down. He was on his side between the freezer unit and the back wall, tucked into a gap barely wide enough to breathe in, one arm pressed hard against his left ribs. His shirt was dark with something that wasn't water. His face was the color of old concrete. For a full 3 seconds, Sloane didn't move. Then he coughed a wet, broken sound, and her body made the decision before her mind could argue against it. She dropped to her knees on the rubber floor mat. "Hey," she touched his shoulder. He flinched, his eyes flying open, dark, unfocused, pupils blown wide. "You're bleeding. I need to know how bad." "Don't." His voice was barely a rasp, scraped raw. "Don't call anyone. I'm not calling anyone yet. I'm trying to figure out if you're dying in my kitchen tonight." Something shifted behind his eyes, a fraction of focus returning, like he was dragging himself back from somewhere far away. He looked at her, actually looked at her for the first time. "Who are you?" "The person who decides whether you live or not," she said. "So let me see." She had spent 4 years taking night classes at Tampa Community College toward a nursing degree. She'd had to pause when her brother's medical bills started eating everything. She was not a nurse, but she had learned enough, read enough, sat in enough hospital corridors, watching enough things happen to people she loved, that she wasn't useless here. She pulled his arm away from his ribs. He let her. His jaw locked so tight she could see the muscle twitch in his cheek, but he let her. The wound was bad. Not unsurvivable, but bad. Something had gone into his left side, below the ribs. The entry was clean. No exit. Whatever was in there was still in there. "This needs a hospital," Sloane said quietly. "No hospital." His hand closed around her wrist, suddenly shockingly strong for a man who had lost this much blood. "No ambulance. No calls. Not tonight. You will bleed out. Not if you help me. I'm a waitress. You know what you're doing." He was watching her hands, the clinical way she had assessed the wound, the fact that she hadn't panicked, hadn't run. "I can see it." Sloane sat back on her heels. The storm outside had graduated from roar to shriek, the corrugated steel roof of the marina kitchen shuddering above them. She looked at the man bleeding on her floor, roughly 6 feet, mid-30s. The shirt was expensive, the kind that got custom-tailored, now absolutely ruined. His face, even pale and sweat-soaked, carried that specific brand of authority that didn't come from confidence alone. It came from never having been told no enough times to lose it. She had seen his face before, not personally, on the business pages of the Tampa Bay Tribune, on the side of the new mixed-use development going up on Bayshore Boulevard. On a bronze placard outside the Performing Arts Center her brother's school had taken a field trip to last year, the one with the Cresswell name on the wing. Everett Cresswell, CEO of Cresswell Maritime Holdings, which was a respectable name for a company that respectable people understood, did not confine itself entirely to respectable things. She owed this man nothing, his world, his violence, his blood. None of it was her problem. She could walk out the back delivery entrance, get in her 12-year-old Corolla, and take her chances on the flooded causeway. She thought of Danny, 17 years old, spending tonight in a rehabilitation hospital bed 40 minutes north, learning how to use his right hand again after the accident that had nearly killed him 6 months ago. 12 more weeks of physical therapy. Another surgery scheduled in the fall. A bill that had cleared $200,000 and was still climbing. Sloane could not afford to be the kind of person who walked away. She had used up that option a long time ago. "Don't move," she said. She raided the restaurant's first aid kit first, which was designed for minor burns and the occasional sliced finger, and was therefore laughably inadequate. She supplemented it with what she could pull from the dry storage room. A clean linen tablecloth she tore into strips, a bottle of the highest proof spirits she could find, a bag of ice from the machine, and the roll of industrial cling wrap the kitchen used for covering pans. It wasn't a trauma kit. It was barely a plan, but she had pressure, she had sterile cloth, and she had the rudimentary knowledge of how to use them. She worked in near darkness, one handheld lantern balanced on the freezer shelf above them, the hurricane eating the world alive outside. Everett Cresswell did not make it easy. He was conscious enough to be uncooperative, fighting her twice before she put her face close to his and spoke in a tone she usually reserved for her brother at his absolute worst. I am trying to keep you breathing. You can either help me do that or I can walk out that door. Those are your only options. Pick one. He stopped fighting. She packed the wound, applied compression, wrapped it as tightly as she dared. It wasn't going to hold indefinitely. It was going to hold long enough, she hoped, for the storm to break, and for whatever complicated machinery ran this man's life to come rescue him. Talk to me, she said when she had done everything she could. She needed him conscious. Why were you behind my freezer? A pause, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. There were 3 of them. They had the parking lot covered. The kitchen door was the only way in a timing. 3 of who? People who don't want me to attend tomorrow's Port Authority vote. Sloane stared at him. Someone tried to kill you over a Port Authority vote. The contract attached to that vote is worth $460 million. His voice was steadier now, fractionally. The bourbon she'd made him swallow had helped. People have been killed for considerably less. Who sent them? The dark eyes cut to her, direct, assessing. Why do you want to know? Because I'd like to know how scared to be. He was quiet for a moment. You know who I am? I figured it out. Then you know the kind of people I deal with. A pause. Torino Group, they've been trying to push Cresswell out of the southern port contracts for 3 years. This is an escalation. Sloane filed the name away and didn't ask more questions. In the kitchen of a hurricane-battered seafood restaurant, with a man who ran organized criminal interests through a legitimate maritime company bleeding on her floor, information was not a gift. It was a chain. The hours passed the way bad hours do, slowly, in increments marked by the storm's mood swings. The hurricane peaked somewhere around 2 in the morning, the kind of intensity that stops sounding like weather and starts sounding like something fundamental coming apart. Sloane sat with her back against the freezer, checking Everett's pulse and his bandaging every 20 minutes, keeping him talking when he started to drift. He was, she discovered, a bad patient and an unexpectedly honest person. You should have left, he said at one point, somewhere around 3. I know, most people would have, I'm aware. Why didn't you? Sloane watched the lantern light move across the stainless steel surfaces. I have a brother, 17. He was hit by a truck that ran a red light 6 months ago. He had internal bleeding. The paramedic who got to him first kept him alive for 9 minutes before the ambulance arrived. She paused. 9 minutes is not a long time to most people. It was the difference between Danny being here and not being here. I figured I owed the universe one. Everett didn't say anything for a while. Then, how bad is it? The medical situation, bad enough that I'm working 3 jobs and still losing ground. I'm sorry. It was such an unexpectedly plain thing for a man like him to say that Sloane didn't know how to respond. She didn't try. The storm broke just before dawn, the violence of it unspooling into a wet, exhausted quiet that felt almost surreal. The first grey light was leaking under the kitchen door when the sound started outside. Not wind this time, but engines. Multiple vehicles, heavy ones, moving fast into the marina parking lot. Sloane crossed to the small window above the dishwashing station and wiped the condensation clear with her sleeve. 4 black SUVs were parked in a loose perimeter, and men in dark clothing were moving toward the building with the coordinated certainty of people who had done this kind of thing many times before. Your people, she asked. My head of security, Rourke. He would have been tracking my phone. Everett's voice was rough but present. Don't go out there alone. Stay beside me when they come in. Why? Because they don't know who you are and they are not gentle with unknowns. Sloane heard the delivery door handles. She moved back to where he was and crouched down beside him, her hand finding his arm without thinking about it. The door came open. 3 men filled the frame, and the lead one, broad-shouldered, a scar running jaw to ear, eyes that catalogued every inch of the room in under 2 seconds, stopped when he saw her. The gun came up before he finished stopping. Hold, Everett said sharply, with an authority that cut straight through his own physical wreckage. She's with me. Stand them down, Rourke. Rourke looked at Everett, then at Sloane, then at Everett's improvised bandaging, the blood-soaked linen, the bourbon bottle. A calculation happened behind his eyes. He lowered the weapon and made a hand signal to the men behind him. Sir, Rourke said, already moving toward Everett with the focused efficiency of a man accessing a problem. We have a medical team outside. In a minute. Everett's hand had found Sloane's wrist at some point. She wasn't sure when, and he hadn't let go. He looked at her. Your name. Sloane. Sloane. He repeated it the way someone files something important. Rourke is going to want to ask you questions. You don't have to answer anything you don't want to. His grip on her wrist tightened briefly. But don't disappear. Please. It was the please that surprised her. Men like Everett Cresswell did not typically arrive at please. She was still processing that when Rourke's hand landed on her shoulder and guided her gently but firmly toward the kitchen door, and the next hour became a blur of medics and bright lights, and a man she'd never met sitting her down in the back of one of the SUVs and telling her, in a very quiet and very serious tone, that she was being taken somewhere safe and that she should not be alarmed. She was absolutely alarmed. She woke up in a room that smelled like fresh linen and central air conditioning, and for 3 disorienting seconds she had no idea where she was. Then she saw the skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Tampa Bay spreading out in the early morning light, the Sunshine Skyway Bridge in the distance, and the events of the previous night returned to her in a single cold wave. She was in an apartment, a very large, very expensive apartment. Her shoes were on the floor beside the bed. Someone had draped a blanket over her while she slept. Her jacket, still faintly blood-stained, was folded over the back of a chair. Her phone was on the nightstand, and it had been plugged in. She picked it up. 4 missed calls from her building's neighbor, the woman who looked in on things when Sloane worked nights. A text from Danny's overnight nurse. "All quiet here. He had a good night." Sloane pressed her thumb to the side of her phone and breathed. "You're awake." The voice came from the doorway. She looked up. A woman stood there, 50s, steel-gray hair pulled back in a precise bun, wearing a blazer the color of slate. She looked like the kind of person who had handled complicated situations for a very long time without blinking. "I'm Catherine. I work for Mr. Cresswell. He asked me to be here when you woke up." "Where is he?" "In surgery on the 4th floor of a private medical facility 2 blocks from here. The bullet nicked an artery. They've been working on him for the past 3 hours." Catherine's expression didn't change. "He's expected to survive. You managed to slow the internal bleeding enough to make the difference." Sloane sat with that information for a moment. "I need to get to my brother," she said. "Of course. A car will take you wherever you need to go." Catherine moved into the room with the deliberate calm of someone delivering complicated news they've rehearsed. "Before you leave, Mr. Cresswell asked me to give you something." She set a folder on the nightstand. Daniel Hart, currently admitted to Suncoast Rehabilitation Hospital, North Tampa campus. He asked his legal team to begin processing a private care arrangement this morning. Full coverage of the outstanding balance, the upcoming surgical costs, and the remaining rehabilitation schedule. Additionally, a monthly allowance to compensate for the income you'll lose when you reduce your work hours. Sloane stared at the folder. "Why? He said you told him about your brother last night." "I didn't ask him for anything." "No," Catherine looked at her steadily. "He said that too." The silence stretched. Sloane didn't touch the folder. She understood gift-giving from men who operated in power the way Everett Cresswell did. She understood that gifts were architecture. They built walls around people. They created obligation and proximity and the quiet, compounding debt of gratitude. "What does he want in return?" she asked. "He asked me to tell you nothing, that it comes with no conditions." A pause. "I've worked for this man for 11 years. In that time, he has not done this before. I'm telling you that not to persuade you. I'm telling you because I believe you deserve the accurate information." Sloane picked up the folder. She opened it. Danny's name was at the top, and below it were numbers that represented years of her life. Every night shift, every skipped meal, everything she had told herself she didn't need, and the notation that they had been resolved. She closed the folder. She set it back on the nightstand. "Tell him thank you," she said, "and tell him I'd like to meet with him when he's recovered." She left the folder where it was, took her jacket from the chair, and walked out. She spent the next 3 weeks in a state of deliberate, focused normalcy. She visited Danny every afternoon. She took him to his physical therapy sessions and watched him curse and sweat through the resistance band exercises with the furious determination of a 17-year-old who had been told he might not fully regain the use of his hand and had decided that information was incorrect. She worked her 2 remaining jobs. She slept, some nights, almost adequately. She did not hear from Everett Cresswell. She thought about him more than she wanted to. Not in a soft way, not with any of the romantic architecture that other women might have constructed around a handsome, powerful man who had looked at her the way he had. She thought about him the way she thought about problems she hadn't solved yet. At odd moments in the silences, with a persistent, low-grade alertness she couldn't turn off. He had trusted her with his life inside of 30 seconds. He had let her hurt him, in the service of keeping him alive, without fighting past the first 2 attempts. He had said sorry to her like he meant it and pleased to her like he'd meant that too. She didn't know what to do with any of it. On the 22nd day, Rourke knocked on the door of her apartment. He was alone, which she registered as either a good sign or a sophisticated trap, and he held an envelope in one hand and looked mildly uncomfortable in the way of people who are usually frightening and have been asked to do something non-threatening. "Mr. Cresswell would like to meet with you," he said. "At your convenience. There's no pressure. He wanted me to make that extremely clear." A pause. "He made me practice that part." Sloane almost smiled. "Tell him Tuesday, noon. He can come here." Rourke blinked. She suspected no one had ever told Everett Cresswell to come to them. "I'll pass that along," he said. He came on Tuesday. He arrived at 11:58 in a car that was trying very hard not to look like what it was, with Rourke waiting at the curb and no additional entourage. He was moving carefully, the ghost of the wound still present in the way he held his left side. But he was upright and sharp-eyed and wearing a charcoal jacket over a dark shirt, and he looked, fundamentally, like a man who had decided to be inconvenienced by nearly dying and had mostly processed that inconvenience. Sloane made him coffee. He sat at her kitchen table, which was small and scratched and had a ring stain from a mug she'd had in college, and he didn't look at any of that the way she'd half expected him to. He just looked at her. "You didn't take the arrangement," he said. "No, why not? Because I didn't want to owe you." He was quiet for a moment. "It wasn't designed to create debt, I know." That's what made it harder to accept. She wrapped her hands around her own mug. "In my experience, the things that feel like gifts are the things you end up paying for the longest." Everett looked at her with something she couldn't entirely name. It wasn't offense. It was more like the expression of a person hearing a thing said plainly that they have known for a long time and rarely heard acknowledged out loud. "You're right," he said. "Historically, but not this time? I hope not." He looked at his coffee. "I had it arranged separately. Rourke handled it so that it's not traceable to me. Danny's care is covered regardless of what happens between us. I had it structured that way deliberately." He met her eyes. "I didn't want it to be leverage." Sloane studied him. She had a good instinct for when people were performing sincerity versus possessing it, honed over years of reading tables at the restaurant, reading Danny's doctors, reading the collection agencies that called at 7 in the morning. Everett Cresswell was not performing. "What happened with the Torino group?" she asked. "The 3 men from the marina were arrested." A pause. "By which I mean they were located, and the evidence for their arrest was brought to the attention of the appropriate law enforcement contacts." He said it without inflection, like a man who has long since stopped distinguishing between the technical truth and the practical one. Castellano Torino has been made aware that escalation of this nature carries specific consequences. The Port Authority vote proceeded. Cresswell's contract was awarded. "So it's over." "It's settled." He looked at her. "There's a difference." She understood that too. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, Danny was at his session, and the apartment was quiet in the middle of the day way of places where someone lives alone, and Sloane was aware that something was happening in the room that she had not entirely prepared for. "I want to offer you something," Everett said. "That is not a gift. That would be a job. I'm not qualified for anything your company would need. You're qualified for the thing I'm specifically talking about." He set his mug down. "I have a head of security. I have lawyers and accountants and fixers. What I don't have, apparently, is someone who will tell me to hold still and stop making things worse." The corner of his mouth moved, the smallest possible gesture toward a smile, and it changed his face in a way she wasn't expecting. "My assistant position has been vacant for 7 months because every candidate I've met has been excellent at the job they showed me and poor at the job I actually need done. Which is keeping me honest. Managing the parts of this operation that require judgment that doesn't come from inside it." He looked at her steadily. "You assessed me in 30 seconds on the floor of a hurricane kitchen and made a correct decision under conditions that would have broken most people. I need that more than I need someone who's good at scheduling." Sloane looked at him for a long moment. "I have no experience in the kind of business you run. I know. I'd want a contract. Clean. Nothing that creates obligation beyond the scope of the work, of course. And I want to be able to say no. If you ask me to do something I won't do, I say no, and that's the end of it." Everett held her gaze. "Yes. And Danny's arrangement stays separate regardless. That's already done, and it stays that way." Agreed unconditionally. Sloane stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the street, at the ordinary mid-morning world going about its business below, at the city she had been fighting to stay upright in for the better part of 2 years. She thought about the rubber floor mat and the lantern and the sound of the storm trying to take everything apart. She turned back around. "I want to meet with Rourke first," she said. "And I want to see the actual financials before I make any decisions. Not the public filings. The real ones." Something moved across Everett Cresswell's face. Not surprise, exactly. Something closer to relief, the particular relief of a person who has been waiting to be spoken to like an equal by someone who means it. "I'll have them sent over today," he said. Sloane picked up her coffee. "Good. Then we'll talk again on Thursday." It was not a fairy tale. It didn't feel like one. Sloane knew, in the weeks and months that followed, that she had walked through a door that didn't lead back to the life she had before. Not because someone had taken that life from her, but because she had set it down herself, quietly, on a scratched kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon. She had chosen a harder thing, a more complicated thing, a thing that required her to stay awake and specific and honest in ways that exhausted her regularly and that she had, somewhat to her own surprise, no desire to walk away from. Danny got the surgery in October. She was in the waiting room when he came out of anesthesia, and he grabbed her hand and said grumpily that it didn't hurt as much as last time, which was his version of "I'm okay," which was his version of "thank you," which was enough. She didn't become someone else. She didn't transform into a harder or more dangerous version of herself. She stayed exactly who she had been in that hurricane kitchen, direct, practical, unimpressed by money and appropriately afraid of violence, and that, she came to understand, was why it worked. Everett Cresswell had spent his entire adult life surrounded by people who bent toward him. He didn't need another one. He needed someone who would stand in the same room and refuse to move. The night of the Cresswell Annual Foundation Gala, 8 months after the hurricane, Sloane stood at the edge of the waterfront terrace in a dress she had actually spent money on, watching the city lights double themselves in the bay. Everett came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and they stood together for a while without saying anything. "You never took the original arrangement," he said eventually. "No. Does that still bother you?" Sloane considered it honestly. "No, it was the right call. It meant I was here because I decided to be." He looked at her. The gala was going on behind them, crystal and laughter and the careful performance of wealth, and out here it was just the bay and the dark and the two of them. And Sloane felt very clearly that this was one of those moments that divides things, before and after. "It matters," Everett said quietly, "that you decided to be." Sloane looked at him, at the man she had kept alive on a kitchen floor in the middle of a storm, at the man who had said sorry like he meant it, and please like a person, at the man who had sent her brother's files and told his team to make it untraceable and unconditional. "I know," she said. The bay went on shining below them. The city held itself together the way cities do, imperfectly, persistently, against considerable odds. And Sloane Beckett, who had learned everything she knew about survival from the years before this one, put her hand on the railing beside Everett's and let the night settle around them both. She had walked into that kitchen to close up a restaurant and lock the doors against a storm. She had come out with something she hadn't known to want. Not rescue, not reward, not a story with clean edges, but a life that was genuinely, complicatedly hers. That was enough. That was, she thought, exactly enough.